And my approach to teaching animal welfare really depends on a fundamental understanding of the origins of animal domestication. So the roles of humans and animals then, and then the significance of what's happened in the thousands and thousands of years since, urbanization, social movements, where we arrive at agriculture in its modern form. Well, I think if we're going to talk about skill and skill level, I think it's important also to sort of understand what does and doesn't exist there from the scientific perspective, but also from the value of the lived experience perspective. And skill really relates to one's ability to do something well. So at the minimum, in terms of animals, that really means preventing suffering, pain, and stress as much as we're able.
Welcome to MeatsPad. In collaboration with the American Meat Science Association, it's a platform dedicated to share breakthrough knowledge that is accessible to the global meat industry. On each episode, you'll have the opportunity to listen and learn from meat specialists and professionals about the whole meat industry. This podcast is brought to you by the U.S. Meat Export Federation, Ultrasource, equipment and supplies for the meat and food industry.
Hello, meat folks. Welcome back to the MeatsPad podcast. It's your happy, hungry host, Phil Bass, back with another animal enthusiast this week. Not necessarily a meat scientist, but definitely one that is connected to the meat world. Dr. Ruth Woiwode. Woiwode?
Why Woody? I don't know.
Why Woody? It's a very unique name, maybe we'll get into that, the history of the Woiwode clan at some point, but no, that's for another time. But Dr. Ruth is an assistant professor and extension specialist in animal behavior at the University of Nebraska Lincoln, and so thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Phil.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about what it is you do there, because before we got to recording, you were mentioning that it is a very unique position, and I would have to agree with that. Not every university animal science department has an animal behavior specialist. I would say at the University of Idaho, where I am, we all try to fit into that role somehow and fit it into our lectures and teaching opportunities, but nothing that is specific. We don't have a specific animal behavior specialist. And so tell us a little bit about what it is that you do there and maybe some of the classes you teach.
Sure. Well, I think it's helpful to understand, first of all, that I have a three-way appointment. So as I talk about this, I'll talk about my work in each of those mission areas in teaching, research, and extension or outreach. And understanding that, of course, is key to understanding what I do. But I'll also draw your attention to the idea that animal behavior and welfare, though closely related, are not synonymous. One relies on the other for sure. And again, they're related, and we'll get into that a little bit. So if I'm being a purist, and in each of our disciplines, I think we like to be, I'm not an animal behaviorist. So I can subscribe more to the school of ethology, but also do some really applied research. And we can get into that a little bit more in a minute. I think what probably has some pretty broad reference and application to most of academia would be the approach to teaching. So currently I teach a junior level elective animal welfare class. And as of this spring, we're offering for the first time ever also a fundamentals of animal behavior and welfare class, which is now part of our core curriculum required for all of our animal science undergrads or majors.
Wow.
And so my enrollment, my teaching contact is quadrupled in numbers this semester alone. So in the middle of a three-way appointment, I have the joy of balancing that. But I can't just express enough how rewarding it is to see their excitement and enthusiasm. Because if we think about animals and animal behavior pretty universally, most human beings are really interested in animals. We're interested in them from a very early age. And so that's some common ground that I try to establish pretty early on across all subject matter, whatever we're interested in, ultimately specializing in, and I encounter a lot of undergrads that are already working in our meats lab here, or will have the opportunity to participate in our Timmerman feed yard internship. those types of things. So they already have some of those ideas maybe established, but there's still this common ground. And my approach to teaching animal welfare really depends on a fundamental understanding of the origins of animal domestication. So the roles of humans and animals then, and then the significance of what's happened in the thousands and thousands of years since urbanization, social movements, where we arrive at agriculture in its modern form.
Mm-hmm.
I asked students to identify why humans were initially interested in domestication of animals, and we engage in group discussion. So they're hearing from their peers as well as just from the one person standing at the front of the room. Mm-hmm. But while we often agree that the benefits can be summarized as mutual, that we gain from that domestication or even symbiotic, that's rooted in that our need for survival. Humans were interested in animals for food security, and in the inverse is also true, right? Humans provided some shelter and provision and protection for animals as well. But the reality is, if we go back and look at the anthropological roots, the historic roots, is that domestication includes so much more than just those basic needs. It really allows there to be a depth of meaning and quality of life for each. That includes companionship across all species. Mm-hmm. And particularly even dignity in death. And that's where the work that I do, gets a little bit closer to meat science. They certainly can't be separated from each other. But that approach, I think, has enormous relevance for where we find ourselves in modern agriculture from a couple of perspectives. As we think about the movement that we've seen, especially since COVID and the supply chain interruptions, where the urbanization, the reverse of that is actually true. We're seeing a movement away from urban areas, again, interest in backyard farming. So people without a lot of that generational background, that experience raising livestock, are now interested in having some chickens, maybe having a goat or maybe a milk cow, being able to provide some of their own food, certainly not all of it. But understanding where it came from is becoming more and more important, again, in today's, in the context we find ourselves. So understanding, again, that common ground, even though their agriculture looks very different in mainstream, if you will, from some of those trends that we see, there's still common ground, and a common ground that can be found. And I think that common ground for our undergrads today, understanding it and being able to talk intelligently about it, is going to serve them well in whatever their roles they may find themselves in agriculture. And so that's why I start there and lay that foundation, because I think that sets them up to be successful and to make meaningful connections with people in all walks of life, wherever their paths take them.
Yeah. It's fascinating how you do set the foundation of how humans do have this natural instinct to maybe gravitate towards animals. And I'm sure a lot of that had to do with the early domestication of livestock and other animals. And ultimately the selection of those that maybe interacted well with us, right?
Exactly.
So
that's a key point, and that's one of the things that when I'm encouraging students to get curious and think back to what the world might have looked like then, and why certain species were domesticated while countless others remain undomesticated to today. I offer the theory that perhaps suggests some choice, and the idea that beyond just our interests, right, that there was certainly an interest on the part of the animals that became domesticated, and why. What are the characteristics of those animals that are so different from others or more compatible with domestication? And just as you said a moment ago, that idea that we've been interested in animals, observing their behaviors, watching them as we coexist and live in close proximity to them. But I tease my students a little bit. Don't kid yourselves. They've been watching us too, and they're watching us all the time. They rely on observation as its survival value, right? So all of the behaviors of their conspecifics, their same species, and many other species around them, humans included, have always had enormous survival value. And they're really, keyed in to that type of information in a way that we aren't. But it goes so much deeper than just survival. And as we think about some of going back to our basic roots in psychology, whether the concept or the principle can be applied to humans or animals, I think it holds true for both. And that's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right?
Mm-hmm.
First, we're interested in our basic needs for survival. We understand that in animal species, right? If an animal if we can't get them comfortable enough in the environment that we manage them in, we can't get them to breed and reproduce, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there has to be a certain level of comfort, but they have to be able to survive first before those secondary needs are met. And ultimately reproduction, right, serves a function in terms of survival for an animal. But once we have those basic needs met, then we start to look more at quality, right? As a life kind of opens up, whether that's from, we characterize it from a human lens, but it really is true for animals. That you see their shift in behavior from if they've been frightened, experienced pain or fear, and they've been in fight or flight mode, when they change and when they realize that they're safe, right? They're able to sort of release that energy. They physically discharge energy that has been generated as a fight or flight response. So they process it, they get rid of it. And then when they're feeling safe enough, they're able to go about their life. Oftentimes, first that'll be drinking, next eating. Then it might look like grooming, another animal or just interacting with them. So we go from survival to, okay, we escaped, we survived, our basic needs met. What's happening around us? And if we dig a little bit deeper into that idea of choice, which is, that's an ask for some, for sure. And I argue that there's a pretty powerful argument just in the number of species that remain undomesticated, and that's a pretty compelling body of evidence. And so then we think about motivation, right? We can certainly recognize and categorize the human motivation for domestication of animals, and beyond even survival, companionship, draft, right? All of the things that we recognize humans have benefited from that relationship by. But what beyond that? So if we think about consumption, not only of products that can be accessed while animals are still living, what about then the consumption of meat? And how does that fit? What motivates an animal then to engage in and enter into, this dynamic that ultimately may result in the ultimate sacrifice? That begs the question then, what do we all know to be true about life? And here we are, and as sophomores in college, having to come to grips week 1 of class with our mortality, right? The reality of life is death. So it's inevitable for all life forms, for us included. And if I were to imagine what it would be like being an animal, Dr. Temple Grandin was one of the ways she described it has stayed with me for years. And it's that idea that nature is cruel, but we don't have to be. So there's this added idea of what we have, the value that we give to animals, that we bring to them in domestication, has to be enough to be worth that sacrifice. And so beyond just getting their basic needs for survival met and a pretty decent quality of life, there also needs to be dignity in death, and a sense and the reality of that relationship today is that animals continue to give and to impact human lives through all of the products that we use for days, months, weeks, years, long after they're gone. So they're quite literally changing lives, just in the same way that we talk about humans changing lives around us. And it looks different today than it did in nomadic cultures or in the cultures of like Plains Indians, for example, when they would carry some of the organs with them. They would use bladders as flasks, right? And they would craft armor and jewelry out of bones, that type of thing. So those animals really became a symbolic part of even their identity, their clothing, and so forth. So they carried physical pieces of those animals that with them. And when you think about it, the symbolism that has been a part of that human animal dynamic for thousands of years, I mean, it's there's so much history, and there's so much that I wish had more of that had made it into even the scientific literature. And so that's one of the things that I think there's a lot of opportunity for. I see that as being wide open. As that pertains to skill, there's learning that occurs over time, right? But now one of the things that we'll talk about, I think, is skill. So we've got that basis. And really that framework is what's led me, I think, to identify the areas of research that I'm focused on. And if I were to distill that into something pretty tangible, it's the idea of understanding differences in human or handler skill level, and how that skill level is related to animal outcomes, but also to handler safety.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and let's go into that because I know you've done research in the amount of the human skill level that is interacting with those animals, and so let's talk about that. From my anecdotal perspective, I know that it's much easier to move livestock if you kind of have a better understanding of how they operate and how they think. And that's very much anybody who's working with any animals. And so tell us a little bit about how that skill level and understanding of the animals plays into how those animals react.
Well, I think if we're going to talk about skill and skill level, I think it's important also to sort of understand what does and doesn't exist there from the scientific perspective, but also from the value of the lived experience perspective. And skill really relates to one's ability to do something well. So at the minimum, in terms of animals, that really means preventing suffering, pain, and stress as much as we're able. And the extent to which we're able to do those things, is precisely what expertise in this space consists of. So here again, it's really important to go back to that 10,000-year history. And if we're to think about the amount of time it actually requires to really understand an animal, their natural behaviors and their natural environment, there is not a substitute for observation, direct observation in gaining that understanding. We can teach behavioral principles in the classroom. They can be written, but there's a reason that most of that knowledge was transmitted generationally, either through storytelling, through children shadowing their parents and grandparents, but it was spoken. They observed initially, and as they grew up around it, and they got an increasing amount of responsibility associated with animals. Time is critical. Now, if you think about how much agriculture today looks different due to the Industrial Revolution, the adoption of technology, and so forth, and where our attention goes, we necessarily don't spend the same number of minutes per day, hours per week, weeks per year observing behaviors that are essential to our understanding functionally of how animals navigate their environment, and then how we need to interact with them for our safety, and also to accomplish those things, reducing stress and handling and so forth. So as I think about the workforce, the people that are involved in direct care and handling of livestock, cattle, pigs, sheep, all major livestock species, we think about, if I were to be hiring somebody, Phil, and you applied to work for me, how would you tell me? How would you quantify your experience with animals? You would tell me that likely I grew up doing it. I grew up with livestock, I spent this many years. I have this many years of experience.
Mhm.
And that is primarily the metric that agriculture relies on to, and I'll say, characterize skill
Mhm.
in
Mhm.
this space. There is not a quantified measure of skill at this point in time. Experts that work in the space each have ideas of what contributes to skill. And I think we recognize not only motor skills, timing, patience, but we also include some of those character traits, whether it's patience, compassion, attention to detail. So it's really, really complex. And the problem is that when most of the agriculture enterprises across all sectors will cite workforce as one of their biggest challenges.
Mhm. Yep.
Recruiting, identified talent, people that want to do hard physical labor, and then retaining them. And then we throw in the added risk of working, especially with cattle. It's true, of course, for other species too, but working in close proximity with large animals is high risk.
Mhm.
Well, how do we continue to be successful in recruiting a workforce in a completely different world when we've never actually documented, captured
Yeah.
what contributes to skill, the characteristics, the qualities, traits that are necessary to be successful in this environment. And success meaning safety for humans and of course safety for animals, and being able to recognize those behaviors that are critical to avoid stress, recognize when there is pain and suffering and respond and care, right? Those are really complex things. So that is something that we're focused on attempting to quantify.
Since 1883, Ultrasource has been a trusted supplier to the food industry. Ultrasource provides superior kill floor, processing, packaging, and labeling equipment and operational supplies.
Mhm. Well, and so that's in your research space, and I want to jump into just a little bit of another similar topic that I hope does kind of blend in well, but you're part of an auditing team or amalgamation of folks out there who are well trained in the animal
Sure.
welfare space. And so I do want to introduce an organization that you've received certification in, PAACO, and you'll have to mention exactly what PAACO stands for. It is an abbreviation, but my understanding it is indeed a measuring system, an auditing system to measure one's ability to handle animals humanely, and I'm assuming mostly in the livestock and meat processing space.
Yeah, so PAACO, the acronym stands for Professional Animal Auditor Certification Organization, and that entity really provides training and certification both for animal welfare auditors, but training related to audit instruments and then certification of some of those instruments. So, and the very first PAACO certified audit was for the meat plant space. That was the guidelines that Dr. Temple Grandin really wrote initially. The Meat Institute Animal Handling Guidelines are certified as an audit by PAACO. And I've served in several capacities related to that. I've been a trainer for some of the initial trainings. I provided shadows for auditors. So to become certified, to become a PAACO certified auditor, one must typically do some online or hybrid type of coursework before attending, often an in-person and sometimes a virtual training. And that training is typically 16 to 20 hours. It varies a little bit by the type of training. But upon completion of that training, which includes a test, so an assessment of the knowledge of the information that was presented in that training. Then the graduates or the people that have attended those trainings are also required to complete a certain number of shadow audits. So that would be to perform, to follow, and to lead a PAACO certified auditor before they can be fully certified. That's at the upper level. And there are some different, criteria, if you will, for in-house training as well. There are new levels. So again, as PAACO's grown, they've expanded beyond the first meat plant audit and auditor certification. They offer swine, dairy, poultry, and feedlot are the primary audits and audit training programs that are offered. And to your point, so the idea of an audit and a standard, a lot of the audits are looking very holistically at an operation enterprise. So that will obviously look very different for a feedlot than it would for a dairy or for the meat plant. But we'll start with the meat plant because there are certain handling criteria that are absolutely scored or evaluated as part of that audit. The reality is that these are outcome based. So they're not actually looking at the quantification of handler skill, but the outcome of handling on animal behavior or the target to a particular category. So, for example, I mentioned skill being related to avoiding stress, and typically something that we're scoring may be caused by something else. So if one of the categories that we're scoring is falls, which we want to avoid, that could have been caused by causing animals to move too fast, right?
Sure.
And of course, not having provided the adequate type of surface, a non-slip surface, for example. But if we want to avoid that, right, instead of telling a handler how to do that, the audits are designed in such a way that it would essentially account for different skill sets, as long as there's an awareness, if you will, of how to avoid, exceeding that particular target. If we know falls, falling is undesirable, then the onus is on the enterprise, the establishment, and the handlers to figure out, right, how to avoid that. So that's a nutshell. I'm not sure if that answered all of your questions about PAACO, but they certainly parallel each other. And the idea of how we score certain categories as an auditor is a great example of how we do things in industry at real time versus what we're doing in science, and the types of instruments that we would use in different contexts.
Sure.
So what we're doing and the instruments that we're creating and using in a controlled environment are far more complex and oftentimes can't be replicated, or we can't do it fast enough, if you will, under field or industry conditions. And it's valuable to continue to have data from the industry where we stand.
Yeah. Well, as you're talking, I'm thinking about how HACCP has changed the meat world dramatically, and we have certification for that. We have mandatory certification in many cases. If you're a USDA inspected meat facility, somebody has to have gone through that type of training for food safety purposes. Now, FSIS, our food safety inspectors, they are definitely part of the umbrella of animal welfare in the packing house. And so for those who are listening, who are operating slaughter facilities, hope you're probably very well aware that the inspectors have that jurisdiction. But I would venture to guess that this certification is starting to be considered more and more for customers of those slaughterhouses who are just trying to do the right thing and demonstrate to their ultimate customers that their sourcing of meat products is being done in a very respectable manner. It's measuring what you're probably already doing correctly anyway, but getting that additional credential, that additional certification by an expert to say, yes, you are indeed doing it correct. Is that kind of the idea behind PAACO?
That really is. It
Mhm.
is. And consistently, consumers say, they tell us in surveys that they are concerned about practices of
Mhm.
agricultural animals throughout the supply chain, and having a third party independent verification of performance to a standard does
Yeah.
provide assurance. They can appreciate that they don't know all of the daily ins and outs, requirements of animal care and food production at every step of the way. But having that independent, true third party role is definitely connected to their confidence. And that's what, and you, I appreciate again the use of the term credential. So having certified PAACO auditors is critical. It
Mhm.
ensures that they have met a specified standard, both of understanding the knowledge, and then having demonstrated the skill required to perform to that standard as an auditor. And similarly, the standards that PAACO certifies for animal care, if you will, in all of these sectors is definitely, it's based on science
Mhm.
and outcomes that are somewhat borrowed from the HACCP idea, the idea of managing relatively few points or measuring relatively few points that are indicators of many management practices
Yeah.
upstream.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of both understanding where meat science, HACCP, and that everything comes into, it intersects,
Mhm.
particularly from the packing plant forward, if you will.
Yeah.
So, and go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, you continue to mention the instruments and facilities, and I like how you said that, exactly how HACCP utilizes specific points to measure for outcomes, yet it is the entirety of the process that ultimately influences those specific points and outcomes. And so, how much does facility design, it's something I wanted to pick your brain about just a little bit, and influence that process. We've already talked about the human interaction part, but then facility design, and especially if there are those out there that may be considering updating facilities, things to really focus on to make sure that if indeed we have a certification program come through, we're going to meet those requirements.
Mhm. Yeah, I think even whether we're talking about humans interacting with animals, so animal handling, or they all that occurs in an environment. And
Mhm.
then at the closer we get to harvest, the more confinement is usually involved in that. So our handling facilities, particularly where we fall under federal regulation, federal oversight, is very important. And many of the PAACO certified audit standards also have similar requirements. Flooring, so the surface that animals walk
Mhm.
on, is one of those that's understood to be universally true, because an animal can slip and fall through no fault of a handler, and that can
Mhm.
be poor flooring. They might have their, and animals are sensory creatures, so they rely on their five senses far more than people do, and primarily vision and hearing would be what we recognize to be the two that influence them the most. And what do we do when we move animals? Oftentimes we'll make sound. We'll whether we're waving a flag or we're carrying a rattle paddle, maybe a plastic bag, something that will make some sound that signals our position relative to them. Because if they don't see us, it's really important for them to be able to determine where people are.
Mhm.
But from a facility perspective, whether we're using solid sides, sheeted sides in our facilities, or whether the idea that vision and what an animal sees, which is different than what a human sees, is really, really important. And one of the things a tool that I use to help illustrate this for, if I'm doing some consulting in a plant related to handling, and we'll maybe take a picture of their facilities, and then we'll look at it in grayscale. And
Mm.
so the contrast that an animal sees versus what a human sees is dramatically different. And of course, there's the lore about seeing red. We want to avoid red and those types of things. And once you realize how different animals' vision is, that's less of a concern. Something like a reflective patch on a safety vest is actually something that creates more contrast and therefore perhaps reason to pause for animals. But shadows, whether there's shadow across the path where an animal will be traveling, or there's an object. Animals, because they, ruminants particularly, it's simple, the structure of their eye is such that they don't see directly in front of them well, and they don't have good depth perception. So as they're moving, and they see something, whether it's a shadow or a hose or something across the path in front of them, it's not immediately evident to them if that's a snake, a pole, or something else. And again, what is the motivation or the purpose of a behavior related to survival value for an animal? That's directly related to survival. They want to make sure that they're going to be able to survive the next few steps, and they'll worry about everything else after that. They judge depth and make those determinations by slowing and lowering their head. What do we tend to do, especially when we're operating under time constraints, right? And animals slow down, we get in a hurry. We try to, we typically apply more pressure, whether that's using sound, raising our voices, whistling, right, calling, and maybe making contact with a handling aid as well. Oftentimes, if we actually give them a little bit more space visually and a little bit of room and time to determine that that's safe, they'll willingly move forward. So vision, and because facilities are so site specific, I really, really try to avoid really black and white, like you always do this or you never do this, because it really is site specific. So there are principles, right? You want to avoid the black hole effect. And so transitions for animals are really important. And if we're moving from outside pens to the inside and we have a change in flooring right at a transition where we're going through a wall, now we have two factors, right? And so again, if we're thinking about it systematically, I encourage people when they're thinking about facility design to really consider these transition points and minimizing the number of variables that are present in those transition points. So we don't want to change our flooring when we're also going through a wall. If the flooring pattern, a mat, can provide consistency there, we've reduced one of those variables. So we're thinking more like animals think, and we're trying to identify friction points and systematically, remove some of those variables so that movement can be more natural. We're trying to avoid some of that stress that they experience in a novel environment.
Sure. Well, I mean, this is we've covered a lot. I know we could talk for another 3 hours. We won't do that to our listeners out there, and I won't do that to Ruth because I'm sure, has other great things going on today. But I want to recap just a little bit, and kind of bring to the attention for our maybe smaller to medium size slaughter facilities out there, that oftentimes, and you mentioned it, Ruth, that to bring folks into our world, the animal agriculture world in general, but meat processing in particular, labor is a big deal. Okay, and we can fix a lot with facilities and equipment, and I know Temple has talked about this in the past. You can only fix half your problems with equipment and facilities. The other half is the human interaction part, and we have to remember, especially for the little processors out there who really struggle to bring in and hold on to talent. I get it, but we need to have experienced people in the pens, and to take that brand new kid right out of high school and shove them in the let's be honest, in the dirty, hard part of the plant where you're pushing livestock, make sure we have somebody there who knows what's going on. Get these people trained. And honestly, let's get some of our best people out there working with the animals. It's the right thing for the animal, but ultimately it's going to be the right thing for the meat product too. So let's not forget that part. So I can't stress enough that it is an entire network of a system that has to be in play when we're working with animals. I want to double down on a few nuggets that you mentioned. Grayscale, that's something that I never think of, but yeah, a reflector on a vest. That's going to be a huge contrast if we're thinking in grayscale, which we always think in color for those who can see color, and livestock can't necessarily have that. And so we're looking at those contrasts. And then I'm just going to summarize a little bit of what you said with slowing down, but there's the old cowboy adage, slow is fast, fast is slow. Give these animals a chance to see what's there, and you won't have to push them in most cases, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. One of the common mistakes that I see is when animals hesitate when we're moving them, particularly in a plant. And this is typically where handler injuries will then occur.
Mm-hmm.
So when animals start to hesitate, we apply more pressure. And the reality is that they're experiencing so much visual pressure, right? What is their reflex? What do they go back to? What's their default mode? Their default mode is fight or flight. If they don't have the time to assess the risk of what's in front of them, they're going to go back where they came from.
Yep.
And so handlers, as cattle slow, almost always, I mean, it is I say instinct, but I think it's an example of a learned bad behavior. We apply more pressure. So now cattle, any of the livestock that we're moving are feeling pressure, and so much pressure behind them, and pressure about the unknown. What that tendency, Temple talks about it all the time, to go back to where they came from. So they're going to turn, they're going to start looking for options. And now we have a handler in really close proximity. And so what I typically coach handlers to do in that environment is the exact opposite of what they think is intuitive. And it's to step back, to give them more space, to actually remove pressure. And because, first of all, it's critical for their safety, especially if you're dealing with larger groups. It's always critical for safety. But by giving them enough space, sometimes we have to back up a ways, but we can, with enough space, take enough pressure off, get that group stopped, and give them a little bit of time to, again, turn around and re-examine where they're going. Once again, if we slow down and we give them time to reason through things, to explore what they need to resolve those concerns, they're far more willing to do things on their own. And that's really the goal. I mean, if we're going to lose in the physics, of war. So we've got to be a little bit smarter, and smarter in this context means really understanding what's driving them, what is motivating those behaviors. And the unfortunate reality is that what you hear oftentimes when cattle hesitate, or any animal hesitates, and they start turning around, and a handler starts to lose control of the situation, they start to oftentimes express frustration, right? Verbally. And it's, so there's a lot of opportunity. I appreciated what you said, that idea of getting some of your most skilled people out there. That's a recipe for success. That is how, going back to that 10,000 year history, that is how that knowledge that took time to gain was historically transmitted generationally. Somebody, the gray beards, as we called them, right? Those that knew from doing and from watching generations before them, that the opportunity to learn under the mentorship, the tutorship of someone like that in a hands-on environment it's invaluable. And I can't stress that enough as it pertains to continuing all of the changes related to that are driven by technology that we've seen and will continue to see. We're dealing with domesticated animals that really exist as a condition of human contact.
Yeah.
And to understand the value of that to them really drives the need for us to continue to invest in people that find the value in the work that they're doing. That's where it's still mutual today, Phil. And I can't stress that enough.
I agree 100%. I mean, all the way down to the guy loading boxes in the truck. You have to have the right people doing the job, and
Right.
and you're gonna get it done correctly and well if you
Yeah,
have if you've made the investment in the person.
that's exactly right.
And contrary to not contrary, but counter to the box analogy, the box isn't going to fight back other than gravity.
Right.
Livestock can, and you can put yourself in a pretty dangerous situation if you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, and that's why skill is especially critical when working with animals, because if we're looking at Department of Labor statistics, one thing that should make us all wake up as we think about what we need to do to support this industry, for approximately the 5-year period most recently reported, death among agricultural workers, for those that were involved in crop production, those were on a steady decline. And for those that were involved in animal production over the same period, death from injury was on a steady incline, at the rate of approximately, I believe, if I'm citing it correctly, 22 in approximately every 200,000, which is enormous when we think about it, and we think about the impact of that on lives. Obviously, the life lost, but the family surrounding those people. But what's really most important is both industries were adopting technology at that same time. The reality is that we can operate autonomous vehicles, we can adopt technology in environments where there isn't the autonomy of an animal. And that's what's so different. And that's why we've got to be really intentional about investing in people and ensuring that we continue to keep people involved in animal care and handling.
Yeah. Yeah, those livestock don't have a lockout safety switch, and so let's be real about that. So to kind of wrap things up a little bit, I like to ask folks about how they got to where they are, and I think this is a really good transition because you're mentioning the teaching, and you have had some pretty amazing mentors, and so maybe how did you get involved in this space initially? What drew you to it? And tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I grew up on a homestead operation in North Dakota, so I probably was riding horses about as early as I could walk, and I broke all the rules. I was out barefoot among horses, but I grew up with them. I understood their behavior. I was really comfortable with them, and so animals were an essential part of my childhood growing up. I found a lot of meaning there, and I worked across species. And I don't think I could have predicted that this is where I would be. In fact, at one point in my life, I really didn't want to pursue any education beyond high school. I was fed up at one point in time. And my trajectory has always been a little non-traditional, and is going back to where our paths crossed at Colorado State University. When I went back to school to complete a bachelor's, thinking as a single mom, thinking that I was headed for vet school because I knew I wanted to work with animals, but I also wanted to achieve a professional degree. There were a couple of reasons. I had spent a lot of time examining that. I'd already earned a business degree. I had worked in business and business administration, and it would be I'd be remiss if I didn't say even the enthusiasm of people, and by exposing myself to really broad experiences while I was completing my undergrad at CSU. I meats judged and did other things, and the enthusiasm and all of those experiences left lasting impression on me. Your enthusiasm, our paths initially crossed in ANEQ 360, and your approach to fabrication. I mean, I recall some of those details to this day, and it was because of the enthusiasm, right? The meaning that you found in what you were doing. And that was inspiring then. And that is one of the things that really, I think, has brought me here today, is when we experience that from mentors. I was mentored, of course, by Dr. Temple Grandin, but by Gary Smith, Keith Belk, Daryl Tatum, and others. And when you've had those experiences and had people like that invest in you, you don't have a choice but to find ways to pay it forward and hopefully help provide opportunities for others to experience that wonder and perhaps see these possibilities open up that they would have never considered. And that's one of the most rewarding things that I do today.
Ruth, I can't thank you enough. Thanks for being on.
Thanks for having me. It was great to reminisce.
Yeah, absolutely.